Welcome everyone, and it's a pleasure for us to host you today in this webinar. Before we start anything, I would like to introduce my dear colleagues. First of all, Mr. Alexander Fink. Hi, Alex. Good morning.
Yeah, hi.
Co-founder and CEO of ScMI. We'll talk a little bit about what we do and how we develop this joint approach about strategic agility in a minute. Short 2 words on 2 other people in the meeting. You can see in the chat Christian and Beat. They are taking care of the whole chat for this webinar, which means if you have any question on whatever we are showing you or telling you, just write down the question in the chat and we will take a couple of minutes at the end of the session to answer that and try to provide you with the best information as possible. To myself, my name is Charles. I'm a senior consultant for the BMI lab. I'm based in Munich, and I will host the whole webinar together with Alex today. Another information, the session, the whole webinar is currently recorded. So if there is any issue with that, just let us know. If it's not a problem, obviously you just stay in. You will receive all the information, which means the recordings or link to the recordings and also the presentation we are showing you today afterwards, after the webinar anyway, per email, probably beginning of next week. So just to make it clear, you don't have to make any screenshots or whatever. We will provide you with whatever we show you today anyway. What is the agenda for the next couple of minutes? First of all, we thought we would have a part where we would present you our strategic agility approach. A short introduction. What is strategic agility? Where does it come from? Why are we talking about that? Then what are the core steps of such a strategic agility concept? In this case, a workshop format, and then give you an outlook on how the process look like if you want to implement it, if it's something that would help you to define your future strategy as an organization. And as already mentioned, afterwards, we will basically dive into the chat and the questions you have with Christian and Beat together and make a Q&A session. And maybe we have time as well to make a live Q&A and give the opportunity to the one or the other participants to ask a question. What are the goals of our webinar? We would like to, first of all, learn together about this new approach that could and will improve strategic decisions in organization. We would also understand the benefits of the strategic agility approach. Why is it so interesting and important and useful for an organization? And finally, we would like to explore some of the results we already worked on with some of our clients together of the whole strategic agility process as we are going to describe it. But maybe first, before we jump into the topic, I'll give you a very short framework or frame the whole situation. When we talk about strategy in companies, how has been strategy defined until today? Actually, the last decades, you would basically analyze the trends and the changing drivers of your overall environment and the entire world or the regions you're in. That's the first thing. Then based on the trends, you would evaluate them and make a selection, maybe prioritize them and think of how are they impacting us. Define one-dimensional strategy based on this one clear view of the future. The trend is going to happen. We have prioritized this trend number one. The digitalization trend in the world is the one we should follow, and we define our strategy according to that. There is then one strategy. It's a clear one. That's how the future is going to look like. And based on that, you also see then that you have to just afterwards mitigate the risks. So what are the risks if the strategy doesn't work, or the situation in the world is different, and you basically spend more time to justify your strategy because it doesn't always fit to the current changes than basically adapting and implementing the strategy. Something has changed. We hosted a webinar last year after the pandemic broke in. The whole COVID situation made us realize that something had to change. And last year we discussed about how to adapt the whole business model thing to the post-COVID world. And that's how ScMI and BMI Lab came together. Because when you think about the changes that COVID brought to the organizations, to the world, and to the society, it means that the level of uncertainty has never been so high as today. And we need to be much more flexible because a virus, a pandemic, can just appear within a couple of weeks and change everything. And that's why together with ScMI, we have been working for the past 12 months on how to bring two approaches together: scenario management on the one hand and business model thinking on the other. Because we think, as Einstein told, actually you cannot solve problems, current problems, with the same thinking and tools that we used when we create these problems.
Yeah, so maybe that is a good point to take a first look on the solution that we would like to talk about. And what you see here in this little portfolio are two directions that explain the two changes that from our point of view are really important to cope with this new situation. And one is the orange part that you see here, and that is about how we cope with the environment, with the changes outside of our company, outside of our organization. And usually, this is what Charles just mentioned, one tries to explain the future exactly by one prognosis or one trend. And this focus on the one and only future that explains the world around us, that doesn't work anymore. And so what is important is to think in alternatives, to think in alternative futures. There's not just one, there are several possible futures, and we usually call them scenarios, so that we have alternative scenarios that explain how the world around us, how markets, industries, technologies, and so on, how they might develop. And due to the point that we have several of these alternative possibilities, the process of scenario management creates something like a map of the future, a map of the different approaches. And so that is one part of the solution and one part of what we name strategic agility. And the second part has something to do with the strategy itself and with the way companies define their own path into the future. And very often they also see just one path. And our experience is that even in the internal area, companies have to think in multiple options. And multiple options means in this case that there could be not just one business model, there could be several business models, so that a strategy is not just describing one business model. We see that in reality very often, that there is no clear difference between strategies and business models. And the idea here is that a strategy is built on a, let's call it, portfolio of business models. So a company has to to bring different business models together. And first of all, they need to create them, they need to analyze them, and they need to analyze the interconnections between these business models. And so this open view into the future, that is the basis, and it comes in the environment, then it's orange, and it comes within the organization and the company, then it's green. And bringing these things together, combining these approaches, this is what brought us together, and this is what we named strategic agility, because it copes with the changes outside and inside. Yeah, and based on that, and you see the same colors here on this slide, based on this thinking, there are elements of our, let me call it, core businesses. So ScMI provides scenario processes and supports companies in this area. And BMI Lab is focused on business model development. And you see this here in orange and in green. But what you also see is the interconnection, is the area where these two things interact, highly interact, and where the question is, how robust are specific business models against changes in the environment, and what does it mean? And I will not explain this picture in detail right now, because we will come back to that. And I would like to focus on the central part of this model, because that is the part which we would like to introduce in a strategic agility workshop. So the idea is not to come with the overall methodology in the beginning, but to focus on the central parts, and to do that in a compact, in a workshop, to introduce the methodology, the kind of thinking. And this workshop includes the 4 phases that you see here. It includes the business model review, and therefore, of course, you need to figure out with which business models you want to work. We will explain that a little bit more in detail in a second. The second part, that's the orange one, is the scenario evaluation. And evaluation means, yes, we need scenarios beforehand to be able to evaluate. So we have to select suitable scenarios. That will be part 2. And then based on this, we could bring these things together. We could ask ourselves, how robust are business models against specific scenarios? And we will show you a specific approach how that could be done. And what we also have in mind for this workshop is to go even one step further, to step 4, to the strategic interpretation, and to show you, one hand, how could you figure out the focus, a robust approach, and secondly, how could you evaluate business models? So that is the overall idea of the workshop. And within the next slides, we will explain the 4 steps. And later on, we will widen it, and we will come back to the picture with which we started, so that you will get at the end also the overview of the methodology. But now I think it would be good to take a closer look on the single steps, and I hand over to Charles again.
So what is about the first step we call strategic orientation? Strategic orientation has to deal with having a common starting point before defining any kind of strategy. And the strategic orientation has actually one main goal. It's understanding what are we doing today and what are the business model or the several business models we have. That's the very first step. How do we do that? It's very simple. We have developed a very simple tool, a simple visualization, how to describe a business model in 4 dimensions. As you can see here on the magic triangle, that's how we call the visualization tool. we have 4 dimensions: the who, the what, the how, and the value. So we talk about the customer, the value proposition, the value chain, and how we generate revenue. By doing so, usually a lot of discussions occur, because every person in an organization or every business unit in a large company has maybe a slight different understanding of the current business. We decided for this webinar as well that we would not only show you the theory, but also show you a practical result from one of our common projects from the last year. And that's why I think it's better to describe this first step with this example. So we are talking about a European company in the telecommunication industry, and we basically described what they are currently doing. It helps us, as I mentioned before, to understand where are we currently, so that we can think of future and changing drivers and so on. So it's easier to visualize that. In this case, the telecom industry is the main customer segment. They are providing hardware and software and other services, especially based on 5G, 4G and 5G actually. Their main activities in this case are doing some R&D and manufacturing the hardware as well, but also selling to customers. So it's an entirely B2B business. They have a lot of partners. Sometimes the customers are the partners as well. It's also interesting to mention, which means if anything changes in the future, then it's going to be play an important role within the value chain. And on the value side, they generate revenue based on a project business. They sell hardware as well, and they share revenues with, for example, integrators that may take care of the whole installation. The cost structure was also interesting because it's a very important point when you talk about strategy and future development. Where do we have the main cost centers? It's on the one side, of course, the whole R&D and manufacturing. You have to develop hardware and software and produce the hardware and deliver it. You need a lot of sales and business development field force. So you have a whole organization behind that. And also you need a lot of different people from marketing to other. These are the main cost centers. So just to give you an idea how a concrete result, tangible result of this first step would look like.
Yeah, so then we can take a look on the second step. So in the first step, we selected and described a business model. And in the second step, the idea is to introduce scenario thinking, first of all, because working with scenarios is not just using another tool, it's also a different kind of thinking. So opening up for alternatives, working with uncertainty is something different to the usual planning approaches. If you develop scenarios by your own, you run through the phases that you see here on the left-hand side. So you identify key factors. For these key factors, you think about possible alternative developments, and that leads to what we call future projections, and they are combined to scenarios which then form this map of the future. So that is the overall process of scenario development, and usually this process is followed by what we call the interpretation. And the interpretation includes three optional steps. One is the more detailed communication of the scenarios. So if you know scenario planning from the Anglo-American area, it's very much focusing on this communication aspect. The second element is the assessment of scenarios. I will come to that because we believe this is highly important, and this usually leads to a larger number of scenarios that you need to work with. And the third element is the consequence analysis. Because if scenarios explain the world around us, we would like to know, of course, we would like to know what does that mean to us. So in the strategic agility workshop, we could not work out scenarios. We have to work with existing scenarios. And therefore, we have different possibilities. One is that you have your own scenarios and you want to use them in such a process. And a second possibility is that you work with scenarios that exist, and for example, that ScMI could provide. And one set of scenarios that we worked with during the last month very intensively are our own post-COVID scenarios. And you see this picture here in the lower right that are 8 scenarios ranging from the roaring 20s and the old normality about a pandemic decade up to very innovative scenarios like the new global dynamics or the massive virtualization, but also including crisis scenarios. So we have to select scenarios, and in many cases we start with these post-COVID scenarios. And what we could do and what we would do and what is shown on the next slide is the scenario assessment. So we would like to, within the workshop and with the preparatory material, we want to introduce these scenarios. And we want to ask the participants, what do you think? How common or how utopian is a specific scenario? Or how desired, how feared is it? Do we expect it or would it be highly surprising? And based on these questions, we get a ranking of the scenarios that we bring into the process. And we could commonly select 2 scenarios. Sometimes if we would be a larger group, we could also select a third one. But in this example, we would select 2 scenarios. And then it's up to us in the workshop to decide which kind of scenarios this should be. So if we select the expected scenario, the most expected one or the 2 expected ones, then we would work with the usual basis of planning. But we could also go for a desired scenario if we want to design or directly influence the future, or the most feared one if we want to play with particular risks, for example. Or you could also decide for the most utopian scenarios when you want to draw up, draw a group out, if you want to discuss something really new. So it's up to us. You could really design the kind of futures you want to work with in the workshop. And now we should take a look on step 3.
Exactly. So after that, the interesting part is to bring the business model description from step 1 and the scenario that has been chosen in step 2. Each scenario is composed by a lot of elements. So a lot of changing drivers we can use to assess the robustness of the business model we have been describing previously. How does it work? We have, together we have developed a robustness score, which basically is a tool you can use to assess, evaluate the impact of one specific scenario on a specific business model. How does it work? The robustness score evaluates within it's an individual evaluation within a group. So a group of people, let's say the group number 1 on the previous slide is going to work with the most expected scenario, the most expected future. Then they would take the current business model and go through the list of questions of the robustness evaluation or tool. Each person evaluates each dimension of the business model and what the impact is on each aspect of this the business model. regarding or based on the description of the scenario. And then after everyone has done his own evaluation, we bring the evaluations together and discuss that. So to be very concrete, how does it look like? I took from the same project with the same client again, so telecommunication industry. 6 people were part of the group evaluating the most expected scenario. And each person, we brought all the scoring together. So you can see each person gave a score. The score gets from -2 to +2, which means -2 would be a dramatic change. +2 is a positive change, like increasing, decreasing. And out of this individual scoring, we do an overall scoring. What does it tell us, basically? First of all, we can see here, if we look at the colors, the first dimension, the whole customer dimension, seems to be somehow a little bit at risk. We can also see that some of the evaluations are very different from time to time. So if you take, for example, on the how dimension, the third one, you can see that at some point, the first person said it's that the availability of internal resources here is gonna increase in the future, and other person in the group said it's gonna decrease tremendously. What does it mean here? It just means we have to talk about it. Like, why do you think it is gonna evolve in this direction, or why do you think it's gonna decrease? Do we find a way to evaluate that more accurately, or maybe do we have to split the group and have like maybe 2 perspectives on the robustness? So overall, using the details of a scenario, and using this robustness tool, we can evaluate the impact of this scenario, so of this chosen future on the current business, which is going to give us the insights and the material and the inputs for the step number 4 in the process.
Mm-hmm. And when you take a look on the 4th step, you see here the general possibilities that you have within this strategic interpretation. So generally you see this little matrix from the last slide with the different scenarios as columns and the different business models that form the strategy as the rows. And what you could do, and that is shown on the left side, is that you take a closer look on a specific scenario and asking yourself, if the world develops in this direction, in the direction of scenario 2 as an example, which business models should be combined to create a suitable strategy? How could that look like in a specific environment? In the central part of this slide, the question is different, because here you take a closer look on one business model and you ask yourself, will this business model work under different site conditions? Under which environmental frame conditions will this business model work? And is it robust against changes in the environment? And these 2 perspectives, the one on the left and the one in the center, they build the basis to, at the end, define a set of future-proof business models that should define our strategy and that should best hand work in all the expected scenarios. So that is what you see on the right side. And that is the general idea of how we're going to work with the results of this robustness evaluation. But you see, this is the general approach. Within the workshop itself, we will be able to discuss these things generally. But here, to work with that, you need, of course, a closer look on more than one business model and usually also more than two scenarios.
From the business model perspective, within the workshop, we are gaining a lot of new information on how to handle the business model and how to cope with this uncertainty and this expected future, for example, or the most feared future, or the future we've been dealing with. Several potential results are there, and that's basically what the robustness score tells us as well. If the robustness score tells us, for example, that one dimension or all the dimensions or several dimensions have a more negative scoring, and it means that this business model is somehow at risk, and we have to look at maybe potential replacement business models for the future. So that would be a worst case from a business perspective. If your robustness score is completely red and you have a -2 score everywhere, it means that the business model is at risk within this future. And if this future really occurs in the next year, then we will need a new business model. For that, there is an approach we can basically link to that. That would be the business model navigator approach, which is a 4-step approach to develop new and innovative business models. If you have maybe, just as in our previous example, like one dimension seems to be a little bit suffering more than the others under this one specific scenario, it means we have to strengthen this business model. We have to work on this dimension. We have to think about the new critical hypothesis behind that and go through what we call the business model testing cycle, which is basically taking the current concept, identify the new assumptions we have, and then going out and testing these assumptions, validate them, maybe doing from interviews to other experiments. And then from the learnings out of this experiment, adapt the concept and adjust it so that it's getting stronger out of the process. So that would be one opportunity as well. And of course, because not everything has to be negative, one result of the scoring robustness evaluation, could also be that everything is going to increase, like the customer demand is going to increase, the attractivity of our offering or value proposition is going to increase, the willingness to pay is going to increase. It means that our business model as it is right now has a need for more growth or more scaling. We need to scale it to make it bigger, to answer to the whole demand that is coming to us. In this case, it's the same process as when strengthening the business model. We just use the testing cycle. We describe our growth or scaling hypothesis. What do we assume is going to happen? In which aspect do we think the growth is going to be critical? And how can we validate that these assumptions are the right ones? So again, it's a very practical result, not only the global perspective on the scenario and the business model, but also concrete. You can work with the scenario and you can work afterwards on your business model to adapt it and make it basically prepare it to this one future. If we look at the practical side in the workshop, that's how a typical result would look like. Before we start discussing, of course, we cannot disclose all the measures that came out of the workshop and what our client has been doing afterwards. But we have the business model perspective with this robustness score that indicates us where we need to think, in which direction and dimension we need to take care of. And then on the scenario perspective, we have the possibility to discuss the consequences and also the options for the future. Maybe just a quick presentation, how does it work? So we've been running several workshops already we usually have at least one team. We call a team. A team is for us like 5 participants. It should be best 5 persons from your company, and we usually had 5 to 15 participants, so 1 to 3 teams, which means we do have the possibility to let one team work, or the whole teams work with different scenarios. We always have 2 experts from our side, so one from ScMI and one from the BMI lab. It's usually a one-day effort, one-day workshop, due to the current situation, of course, and a lot of people are still working remotely. We can split into half days, which makes it easier to focus in front of a screen, of course. And for that, when we switch to the remote concept, we have all the tools to make it completely virtual, using tools, collaboration platforms like Miro, for example. And basically would, of course, start with an introduction. There is a preparation work from our side and from the decider side as well. But within the workshop, the first part is, the workshop is basically divided into the 4 steps of the process we've just talked about. In addition to that, maybe at the beginning, you can see here we have introductions as well, so that everyone knows what is scenario management, what is a business model, how do we define a business model, and then we can start working on.
Yeah, and now we have taken a closer look into the central steps introduced by the business model review and the scenario evaluation. And if we now step back a little bit and take a look on the whole process, we see that this could, of course, in the beginning include an analysis of the business model landscape of the company, which is here 1A, where you, in the preparatory phase of the workshop, you simply select one business model, but you could do this based on a more detailed analysis of the different business models in the company. So this is why 1A is before, is something which you could run beforehand. It's similar. It's a similar situation on the scenario side. When you take a look on 2A, of course, it's possible to start also with a scenario development. So to create individual scenarios which later on go into this process of robustness evaluation and strategic interpretation. So that is the possibility to get a more detailed starting phase in such an activity. And later on, here on the right side with the numbers 5 and 6, there are, of course, more detailed transfer activities based on such a strategic interpretation, which, if you do that based on an analysis and on scenario development, could be a real strategy development process in number 4. But this could then be followed by the design of new business models. What Charles just explained, if you figure out for a specific situation that there is a need to work out more detailed or to identify new business models, then this could be done in this green box on the right side. And there's also an orange box on the right side, which means that if you have scenarios and if you've done a scenario evaluation once, the process of coping with the future does not stop. From time to time, it makes sense to redo your scenario evaluation and to work that out in the direction of a scenario monitoring. And this is what we do within ScMI for several companies, so that they not develop scenarios once and evaluate them once, but work with these scenarios. So that is the scenario monitoring part. And therefore, we created this overview to explain the whole process of strategic agility. Yeah.
All right. I think we are just in time, actually. Do we have any question? We would open the stage to anyone who has a question within the chat, and then Christian or Beat, you can give us the question. Of course, there is a possibility to write questions in the chat for everyone to be seen, or as a direct message to one of us. So anything we had here.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. Actually, we have just talked to each other, Michael, myself, and we haven't received any question from the chat. And so we recommend, given the time, and we are not so many people, that people can ask the question directly using the microphone, you know, and have an interactive discussion. So yes, please go ahead, and if you want to ask a question, use the microphone. Of course, you can also use the chat, but so let me ask you.
I think we have one question, Mr. Zosayas.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello. Hi. My name is Manuel Berzosa. Congratulations. Very, very useful, very interesting, and it's really nice, this approach. My question was, have you worked this approach with small companies, meaning companies maybe with less than 50 persons or less than 10 billion with a revenue, and with how many people do you participate normally in this kind of workshops? Thank you very much.
Sure. Alex, should I answer? Do you want to answer?
Yeah, go ahead.
So to us, the size of a company is not the most important thing. The most important thing is that you have the right people that can bring the value to this kind of workshop. So if you can find enough people to sit at the table and work on that, I don't see why it wouldn't work. Of course, because of our history, both companies, ScMI and BMI Lab, we are used to work with large international companies, but we also work with smaller companies as well. So it might not be the main client base we have and we work with, but it's part of it as well.
Yeah, from my point of view, especially in the workshop, for smaller companies, it could be helpful to work with existing scenarios. So they don't need to create own scenarios to work with this kind of process. Of course, if you work out your own scenarios, you could do it more specifically. But on the other hand, for smaller companies, it's possible to work, for example, with this post-COVID scenario. So it works fine.
So maybe just to, maybe I've seen on the chat the question, then we can close this. This is related to it. How many people should participate? Managers only? What's your point of view?
Yeah. So we have this one question, and then I think Thomas
has raised his hand. But
let's maybe answer the first one. The proper participant group. So we said we mentioned it should probably be somewhere. It would be great to have like 2 to 3 group of 4 to 5 person, right? And as we mentioned during the webinar, it would be interesting to have not only managers and strategists, but maybe have people from other business units. So of course, I think it's interesting to mix the profiles and the people so that you have different perspectives as well during the workshop. That would be, I think, our recommendation.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is about the people who should participate. Now I think Thomas has raised the question.
Yes,
his hand.
Thomas was first. Thomas, you have a question.
Yes, thanks very much, Thomas from University of Graz. Very interesting approach, this one. I was curious to understand a bit more about the scenario evaluation step. I think that was, I mean, at least for me, not very clear. How do you evaluate all the possible scenarios and how you choose which one you want to focus on? Yeah, I mean, given that it's a narrow timeline of time to do it in the workshop.
Yeah, in this workshop, we evaluate the scenarios. Let me call it generally. So we present the scenarios. The participants get information beforehand, and then they do this evaluation. And you do a ranking of the scenarios so that you see what is the most expected one, what is the most desired one. And based on this relatively simple assessment and visualization, you could do this discussion about the scenario evaluation, and you could decide which are the scenarios that you want to work with. If you think about a larger process with the same methodology, the kind of scenario assessment could be differently. So if we do a scenario development process and later on a scenario evaluation, the scenario evaluation could also be done on the single elements of the scenarios. Then you get a more detailed view of the scenario, of your expectations or your preferences. So you could work with different approaches, but within the workshop, we will select the more simple one to get to a result with the group and to do it more actively in a workshop format.
Thanks very much.
We have one more question from Christoph.
Hi. Very interesting approach. Yeah, same. I want to ask for the business models. You said you develop different options or variants like 1 to D. And I asked myself, if you do it in a one-day workshop, how can you develop 5 business model variants for one company? Because I know a business model is quite a complex thing with diverse interdependencies, and it's really complex to understand for every participant. I asked myself how you do it in a one-day workshop.
Yeah, good question. Maybe I was too quick in the explanation. So in the one-day workshop, we would focus on one business model only. That's the first thing. And within this workshop, we would also focus on thinking about or describing here what I'm displaying. What do we learn from this evaluation, from the robustness? So what do we need to do, or what would we need to do? And we could start making a draft of the actions behind that. We wouldn't go through the whole cycle entirely. We would probably have, I would say, a high-level description of what could be 1, 2, maybe 3 actions to be taken for this one specific business model. What Alex showed afterwards, here, when you design a new business models, it's actually something that would happen after the workshop. So it would be based on the results of this workshop. It would be probably something of a more kind of a project, working on, look, that's what we learned, that's what we think could happen. Now we can start working on a business model, and on the exactly same way, based on the results of a workshop, we can start on the step here, number 6, the scenario monitoring. I think it's the same approach, coping or basically continuing the work based on the workshop results. But within the workshop, we would be very specific and focused on 1 or 2 scenarios with a simple evaluation, and probably only 1 business model. Or depending on the team and on the setup, we could also define like per team, one business model. Could be also an option, actually.
So in practice, it's not really a one-day workshop, isn't it? It's like a workshop series, I guess. How is it?
It's a one-day workshop to learn the methodology and the approach and get first tangible results we can continue work on. And of course, the logical overall approach to that as a company would be, we start with a workshop to understand the benefits, learn the methodology, and explore the first results. And then we can decide how we want to implement strategic agility on the longer term.
So within the workshop, you could neither develop business models nor scenarios. You define a starting point, which means there is one business model we work with, and there is a set of scenarios we start with. And that is the starting point for the workshop, because the idea is in the workshop to really come to the blue part of this process and to feel and to how could we combine these two ways of thinking, and to which kind of results would that lead. And that is the overall idea of the workshop.
Okay, thank you very much.
I think we have other questions, right? If I've seen right.
So there is the question from Axel Gerber. You know, he asked the question about evaluating it, and we discussed it before. So Axel, maybe if you can indicate if the answers from before were fine for you. Then we have Nixon. I have regarding scenario and the target segment market. Nixon, you want to raise it verbally, or is this fine? Just open the mic and you can speak.
Yes, thank you for the chance. Well, actually, my question is about the scenario and the targeted segment market. So this is very important because we are talking about the webinar about the strategic agility. So actually, one of my questions is, because you were explaining about the scenario, it is something like a tryout of doing the business model to the markets or to the customers. And if we're gonna do the tryout, or like the if that's what you mean by the scenario of the tryout, the doing the business model to the market or the segment markets or the customers, and how would that be?
Mm-hmm.
And then the second one is, how is it possible for the customers, I mean the targeted segment markets, do we have to choose or determine the segment market, or the people in the workshop is going to determine the targeted segment markets? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think if you work with scenarios, it is necessary to define what we call the scenario field, the field of observation, for which area you would like to describe alternative futures. And that has something to do with, on the other side, the question, what is the area you want to take strategic decisions for? So here in this picture and the story we've shown, we called it simply a company, and we talk about the company environment. But of course, you could think of different definitions of frame conditions. So you could say, we do this for a specific, let's call it business unit, and then you take a closer look with the scenarios on the segment in which this business unit is active. So it is possible to define the area of consideration for the scenarios based on the organization you work for and you want to take strategic decisions for. So that are, of course, questions you need to answer in the beginning. And the better you define them, the better the results of the process will be.
There is an interesting question from Colin about sustainability. Do the so I would maybe extend the question if I may, Colin, and if I'm wrong, just you can just jump in. But the whole sustainability topic, social, cultural, environmental elements in the whole process. That's one part of doing a webinar. We have to reduce a bit the content, but actually, Alex, I mean, you can explain that better. But each scenario includes these elements: society, culture, environment, right?
Yes. We talk about the topic of sustainability at least from two perspectives. So one is let me call it the political or environmental discussion about sustainability. And the other is more the question of resilience and robustness. And you have to answer your question from these two perspectives. So starting with the last one, I think scenario is maybe the tool to cope with uncertainty and to figure out more robust strategies or more robust decision making, because you do not work with one view on the future only, but with several ones. So talking about sustainability from this point of view, I'm fully clear. If you talk more about the political and environmental issues, we are with what Charles just said, that if you create scenarios, you usually have a broader view of topics which come together. So usually you don't focus on your own industry, you also integrate influence factors which are coming from the political or the environmental or the economic area. And therefore, usually the topics of sustainability are also included. So if we develop scenarios with companies today, climate change or sustainability or environmental issues are part of nearly all scenarios because they influence that. So I would agree to your point from both perspectives, but it's helpful to separate them.
And because the next question came as well about the business model. So of course, that's something I didn't mention here. If I take the 4 dimensions here, we could actually add 2 other dimensions if we want, just to describe the current business model. And it would be the people dimension and the planet dimension. So we have the possibility to extend this visualization with 2 additional elements, which would then bring basically the whole sustainability elements together. Do we have any other questions? I don't think so, right? I mean, we're just right on time. It's 12 in our time.
Please give Thomas his voice. Thomas has a question.
Okay.
Only if there's time. Yeah, a little bit connecting to the last discussion on sustainability. In the scenario development approach that you showed, you start from determining factors and then discuss future projections. I've also seen, and I like it in a sustainability perspective way, to do it more like a backcasting approach. So start from a desired sustainable future, and from there look back. Do you also do that? I mean, is this also, I would guess it's pretty much very easy to combine in this approach.
Sometimes this backward approach is part of a second step in a scenario process. So if we develop scenarios, we really open up a window of different possibilities. And if, for example, based on an assessment, you figure out there is a desired future, then you could go from this static scenarios to a process scenario and ask yourself, how could we come to this future? But it also has something to do with the question, do we talk about external scenarios or do we have an influence on the scenarios? Because it doesn't make sense if you have external scenarios to think about the desired future too much, because it's like looking to the weather report and only thinking about sunny weather. It doesn't make sense if it's going to rain. So but these things need to be in your mind when you plan about a scenario process.
Thanks.
All right, then just a couple of information before we end this webinar. So I told at the beginning you're going to get an email with all the links. You can find that on our homepages as well. Find more resources. For example, on the ScMI website, you can find the post-COVID scenario catalog, which I recommend to download. You can follow us, of course, either us as a person or as a company on LinkedIn. Just look for us, ScMI or BMI Lab. And if there is any following questions or you want to talk more about it, then just don't hesitate to drop us an email. Everything is going to be in the follow-up email anyway. Before we leave, I would just thank every participant, of course. Thank for the interaction at the end as well. It's always better for us to be able to answer questions and get your opinion on what we developed. Thanks to Christian and Beat for the support. And of course, thanks to Alex for co-hosting this webinar today.